been in the restoration for 20 plus years, worked with multiple manufacturers. There are some really good fixes to deal with a nasty crack that could be structural or cosmetic. Here we are focusing on the structural component. Rhino has a product called Crack Repair Kit. It comes in a 1-to-1 multi-cartridge dispenser. They also do have bulk materials that can also be purchased where you would need an injection machine, such as this Field Boss in California. This machine right here is a 2-to-1. You can also get components to set up as a 1-to-1. There are multiple ways to make the repair. With our expertise and our extensive knowledge, we have learned that although the manufacturer may recommend 18-inch installation, those bigger cracks, 18 inches is sufficient. When you deal with a smaller crack, your spacing may need to change to be closer to 6 inches. We rarely and pretty much never install tighter than a 6-inch pattern. We don't have any failed concrete where we could do true installation. We have a mock crack on this concrete column. So what we'll do, first thing we'll do is we're going to inspect the surface. And what we want to know is we want to know if our epoxy pasting material is going to bond to the surface. If we know that the surface is clean and free of contaminants, such as atmospheric soiling, at that point we could start putting our ports on place, but we would have to distinguish what kind of port we'd like to use. If it is not proper for application, we use a ZEC or a diamond wheel or means of sandblasting and prep the surface 1 inch on each side of the crack itself. Once we know that our surface will accept the epoxy pasting material, then we'll have an assessment on what kind of port and what application makes the most sense. Most applications for crack injection are going to have a surface port. Some will require drilling with a larger bit and use a drill-in style port. And there's also a compression port that isn't used as extensively for epoxy. Joe had brought over a few examples of different types of ports. This is a compression port you can see with a Zerk fitting that you'll see on grease inserts for commercial vehicles and vehicular. It's also a modification that you can modify your injection gun. That way it clamps on for higher PSIs. This is a drill-in port. If there is a concern of the surface having the proper profile 3 for correct bonding, this drill-in style is typically what tradesmen will go to. The surface style mount, which is most typically used, has little holes inside, and we'll get to when we apply our surface mount ports. We want to make sure that there's enough material for proper adhesion. This style here from the manufacturer, Rhino, obviously is superior, it has bigger surface footprint. So once we establish what port we're going to install, then we need to consider a few things. We need to establish work conditions, moisture, how many personnel we need on site to have successful application. A couple of things that we always like to consider is on the deeper repairs. Are these repairs on a structural concrete slab that may have post-tension? If it does have post-tension, refer your engineer immediately, because that could affect how the post-tension system operates. If epoxy gets in your sleeve, it could work against the actual percentages needed to keep structural integrity. Let's move on to installing of our ports. Joe will come over. We have a gun set up. What we're going to do is we're going to install some of these ports on our mock crack. Once we install the ports, we'll paste over, make sure we have 3/8 coverage over the crack itself. That way when we inject our material, we don't have leaking of the injection resin. And install the dual cartridge, which is the 1-to-1 pasting epoxy. And Joel will start installing the ports. And we could just use some. And then what I'm going to do here while Joe's getting set up is I'm going to mark out. We can see our mock crack has identified to be a smaller crack at the bottom and larger at the top. So the smaller the crack, the closer distance we're going to install our ports. Here we decided we're going to go 2 inches from the bottom. Then we're going to install our ports at every 8 inches. Where the crack gets larger, you could go up to the manufacturer up to 18 inches. So here we'll go 2 inches from the top. When we inject our material, we're always going to start at the lowest point with gravity and work our way upward. When we install our pasting material, we'll start at the bottom and work our way upward as well. There's times we're working on columns or bigger structures, and this way your cure time is in place so you can not have downtime when you're installing your material.
Here we have Rhino's high strength anchoring system, 2-part. As Eric was saying, first thing we want to do is we have the mixing head here. We're going to mix the 2 parts through the mixing tip, and it's going to come out here. We're not going to use the first little bit to make sure that we have the proper mix going through the gun. So we'll have a little piece of wood here. We're going to run it through the gun system. And as it's running through, you can see the product coming up through the mixing tube, mixing A and B together. The color we're looking for is that dark gray, as you can see it right there. As I put a little bit on here, I'm looking for if there's going to be any kind of mixed color into it, any whites, anything else. Not seeing that, we have a good mix. So, as we look at the crack here, we're going to be covering up the crack right here, but this is right where we're shooting through here. We're going to come back up over the top of it. So we're going to fill in the crack area up to it. And then we're going to grab a port because we got our hole right here. And we're going to go ahead and put a little bit around the edge of it, not to cover up the hole. He's going to paste it on there, and he'll hold it for a couple seconds. And the nice thing about Rhino's port system, if you see the bleeder holes that go through here, that helps the air get out of the epoxy to make sure we got a good suction to the substrate. It was a great design. And then as he holds on to that, I'll go ahead and cover up this crack. Going all the way up. I'm going to stop there. And give him a little bit of epoxy for that.
Well, sometimes what we'll do is we'll get a board or a hard surface and we'll inject some material in a pile, and then we can dip our ports onto that surface. So our main concern is we want to make sure we're using enough material to cover the crack, which we call the process of capping the crack. That way when we start with our injection resin, it stays in the crack and doesn't come out to the surface. If you don't have the proper paste, you're going to have nothing but mess on your hands, and the product's going to end up out of everywhere but where you want it. So Joel will make sure that when he tools the crack, he's going with a light trawl finish we're maintaining 1/4 to 3/8 of thickness of material over our crack. But not only is he doing that, whatever crack is exposed is now filled with our capping material. The pressures that are on the port itself are up to 4,000 psi. If you have your ports pop off while you're in your process, you have to stop what you're doing. And at that point, you have to make an analysis if you needed to wait and come back after the material is cured. It's a lot cheaper and more structurally sound to use extra material around your ports. So always order additional tips and material. The bigger the crack, the more material you'll use. So before you order, always assess your job site and make sure you have an abundance of material. If you don't have enough material to do the entire crack, wait until you have enough on hand. We always install our ports within a couple inches of each end of the visual crack due to we can see the crack from the face, but sometimes there's micro cracks that we cannot see behind the surface. Or when the concrete was installed, there could be consolidation that didn't take place, and there could be voids behind the surface. These ports come with caps that if you're going to be leaving the area alone where they could get contaminated, we will install the caps before we inject the epoxy. And when we're ready to inject, we'll remove the caps all at the same time on each crack location. If we know that it's a clean environment, we will leave the caps in a location in a bucket and install them. That way we know that if they're off, they haven't been injected yet. So we could again do one more there, Joe. Typically, once you install your capping material, you want to wait, 4 to 6 hours before you would inject. And then if you think with your site conditions that your substrate is acceptable for injection, you should always wait an extra couple hours. More times than not, you're going to see 24 hours, or at least the next day if the crew gets done at 4 o'clock. More times than not, they could come in and they could inject the next morning. There are times where we're at the lowest of conditions and we have suspended work. We can't do it twice. We'll give it full 24-hour cure time. So, for example, our ports have been installed, our capping material is in place. We come back once the cure time has taken place, depending on environmental conditions, and then we go to inject our material. Although one person can inject, we typically look at this is a two-man operation. We start at the lowest point. We would inject our material. So at this point, this is also what a 1-to-1 multi-cartridge resin material will look like, except it won't say anchoring epoxy. It will say structural RCF. And this resin, as we inject, we will start at the lowest point. We'll hold our trigger And when we feel a good amount of pressure where it could almost push our tip out of the port, we will wait several seconds. That epoxy on a micro crack can travel. It could take up to 10 to 15 seconds before it can get to where it needs to get. The bigger the crack, the quicker you can move.
Or if you see it.
Another option is once we see it come out of the next port above the lowest port, and we pull off, your assistant or whoever's working with you can put the cap on, then we go up to the next port. Do the same thing, we inject the material, we keep track of how much material we're using, we look for irregularities. If we have similar cracks and some are taking more or less material, that's something that you should discuss. There could be an issue with your tip. These tips can be used on multiple cartridges, but if you had something clog up part of the tip, it could cause you to have to grind out and re-inject and flush out your cracks. So even if you're using the bulk material, we still switch our tips out every 2 hours. Once you have all your ports injected, all the way from the bottom up to the top, we recommend waiting 2 to 4 hours beyond where you think you would need to wait for full cure. We as a team ourselves, we have done injection where we've had Army Corps of Engineers pour the walls that we injected in. Just like any epoxies, you know, UV exposure, potted material, it all sets up faster. The thinner the epoxy goes, without the UV exposure, the longer it'll take to cure. We've had it where the outside face is fully cured, inside 6 inches, but that 50% cure. That shouldn't affect what you do next. If your outside face is fully cured, some engineers will let you leave the ports in place. They like that so people can identify, hey, there's been injection here, this has taken place, this is what happened. The ownership likes to see it sometimes. Typically, more times than not, they'll come back. These ports will have an epoxy inside of them. You can hit them off with a hammer. We'll take a diamond disc, we'll grind it flat, and what you'll see is, what you should see is, you should see epoxy in place where there used to be a crack. At times, where we're dealing with historical applications, we will grind down what you see. We will V out the crack. We will install the same epoxy as a capping material. We'll take a like substance, and typically cementitious, but we could use another piece of concrete, we could use limestone, and we will cap over the epoxy and use that to camouflage the repair. That's a whole nother syllabus. And that's the proper procedure for doing your vertical crack injection. This could also be used horizontally, but typically this is a vertical and overhead application. Thanks. Got any questions?
What happens when the crack is a little bit wider than what you're doing now? Maybe as wide as the ports itself.
Yep. So what happens if the crack is wider, such as the ports themselves? At that point, that is where you would want to use a drill-in port. And the drill-in ports, regardless, you over-drill the crack hole, and you would fill the void with epoxy, and that would be the capping material.